Welcome to Hearthstory Aware, a series dedicated to bringing you books, short stories, and poems that build self and social awareness in young adults and adults alike. Today we'll be looking at a short story from 1947 that was first published in The New Yorker and easily could happen today. It deals with issues of immigration in America and explores the relationship of bystander and protagonist. Listen along for Ray Bradbury's I See You Never.
I See You Never by Ray Bradbury. The soft knock came at the kitchen door, and when Mrs. O'Brien opened it, there on the back porch were her best tenant, Mr. Ramirez, and two police officers, one on each side of him. Mr. Ramirez just stood there, walled in and small. "Why, Mr. Ramirez," said Mrs. O'Brien. Mr. Ramirez was overcome. He did not seem to have words to explain. He had arrived at Mrs. O'Brien's rooming house more than 2 years earlier, and had lived there ever since. He had come by bus from Mexico City to San Diego, and had then gone up to Los Angeles. There he had found the clean little room with glossy blue linoleum and pictures and calendars on the flowered walls, and Mrs. O'Brien as the strict but kindly landlady. During the war, he had worked at the airplane factory and made parts for the planes that flew off somewhere. And even now, after the war, he still held his job. From the first, he had made big money. He saved some of it, and he got drunk only once a week, a privilege that, to Mrs. O'Brien's way of thinking, every good working man deserved, unquestioned and unreprimanded. Inside Mrs. O'Brien's kitchen, pies were baking in the oven. Soon, the pies would come out with complexions like Mr. Ramirez's, brown and shiny and crisp, with slits in them for the air, almost like the slits of Mr. Ramirez's dark eyes. The kitchen smelled good. The policeman leaned forward, lured by the odor. Mr. Ramirez gazed at his feet, as if they had carried him into all this trouble. "What happened, Mr. Ramirez?" asked Mrs. O'Brien. Behind Mrs. O'Brien, as he lifted his eyes, Mr. Ramirez saw the long table, laid with clean white linen and set with a platter, cool, shining glasses, and a water pitcher with ice cubes floating inside it, a bowl of fresh potato salad, and one of bananas and oranges, cubed and sugared. At this table sat Mrs. O'Brien's children, her 3 grown sons, eating and conversing, and her 2 younger daughters, who were staring at the policeman as they ate. "I have been here 30 months, said Mr. Ramirez quietly, looking at Mrs. O'Brien's plump hands. "That's 6 months too long," said one policeman. "He only had a temporary visa. We've just got around to looking for him." Soon after Mr. Ramirez had arrived, he bought a radio for his little room. Evenings he turned it up very loud and enjoyed it. And he had bought a wristwatch and enjoyed that too. And on many nights he had walked silent streets and seen the bright clothes in the windows and bought some of them. And he had seen the jewels and bought some of them for his few lady friends. And he had gone to picture shows 5 nights a week for a while. Then also he had ridden the streetcars, all night some nights, smelling the electricity, his dark eyes moving over the advertisements, feeling the wheels rumble under him, watching the little sleeping houses and the big hotel slip by. Besides that, he had gone to large restaurants, where he had eaten many-course dinners, and to the opera and the theater. And he had bought a car, which later, when he forgot to pay for it, the dealer had driven off, angrily, from in front of the rooming house. "So here I am," said Mr. Ramirez now. "To tell you I must give up my room, Mrs. O'Brien. I come to get my luggage and clothes and go with these men." "Back to Mexico?" "Yes, to Lagos. That is a little town north of Mexico City." "I'm sorry, Mr. Ramirez." "I'm packed," said Mr. Ramirez hoarsely, blinking his dark eyes rapidly and moving his hands helplessly before him. The policeman did not touch him. There was no necessity for that. "Here is the key, Mrs. O'Brien," Mr. Ramirez said. "I have my bag already." Mrs. O'Brien, for the first time, noticed a suitcase standing behind him on the porch. Mr. Ramirez looked in again at the huge kitchen, at the bright silver cutlery, and the young people eating in the shining waxed floor. He turned and looked for a long moment at the apartment house next door, rising up 3 stories high and beautiful. He looked at the balconies and the fire escape and back porch stairs, at the lines of laundry snapping in the wind. "You've been a good tenant," said Mrs. O'Brien. Thank you, Mrs. O'Brien," he said softly. He closed his eyes. Mrs. O'Brien stood holding the door half open. One of her sons, behind her, said that dinner was getting cold, but she shook her head at him and turned back to Mr. Ramirez. She remembered a visit she had once made to some Mexican border towns. The hot days, the endless crickets leaping and falling or lying dead and brittle, like the small cigars in the shop windows, and the canals taking river water out to the farms, the dirt roads, the scorched scape. She remembered the silent towns, the warm beer, the hot, thick foods each day. She remembered the slow, dragging horses and the parched jackrabbits on the road. She remembered the iron mountains and the dusty valleys, and the ocean beaches that spread hundreds of miles with no sound but the waves. No cars, no buildings, nothing. "I'm sure sorry, Mr. Ramirez," she said. "I don't want to go back, Mrs. O'Brien," he said weakly. "I like it here. I want to stay here. I've worked. I've got money. I look all right, don't I? And I don't want to go back." "I'm sorry, Mr. Ramirez," she said. "I wish there was something I could do." "Mrs. O'Brien," he cried suddenly, tears rolling out under his eyelids. He reached out his hands and took her hand fervently, shaking it, wringing it, holding to it. "Mrs. O'Brien, I see you never. I see you never." The policeman smiled at this, but Mr. Ramirez did not notice it, and they stopped smiling very soon. "Goodbye, Mrs. O'Brien. You have been good to me. Oh, goodbye, Mrs. O'Brien. I see you never." The policeman waited for Mr. Ramirez to turn, pick up his suitcase, and walk away. Then they followed him, tipping their hats to Mrs. O'Brien. She watched them go down the porch steps. Then she shut the door quietly and went slowly back to her chair at the table. She pulled the chair and sat down. She picked up the shining knife and fork and started once more upon her steak. "Hurry up, Mom," said one of her sons. "It'll be cold." Mrs. O'Brien took one bite and chewed on it for a long, slow time. Then she stared at the closed door. She laid down her knife and fork. "What's wrong, Ma?" asked her son. "I just realized," said Mrs. O'Brien. She put her hand to her face. "I'll never see Mr. Ramirez again."
This story leads the reader into recognizing that the lives and experiences of others are never quite as simple as they seem, and can be equally difficult to face or to walk away from. Mrs. O'Brien, for example, felt helpless as Mr. Ramirez stood on her porch, his broken words echoing his heartache, with her as the symbol for all he would miss about his life and opportunities working in America. He knows what he is losing and what he will miss out on as he repeats, "I see you never." And throughout the vignette, Mrs. O'Brien seems fully aware that Mr. Ramirez was a hard worker whose character flaws were forgivable compared to his character strengths. Still, it was not until he was gone that she recognized the gravity of the situation, or perhaps wondered if there was anything she could have done to prevent it. While we don't know why Mr. Ramirez's visa had lapsed, or whether he had tried to retain it, it is clear that both he and Mrs. O'Brien recognized the element of hopeless loss in the situation. Now it's time to reflect on what we can learn from this story. Although nearly a century old, it easily could have happened yesterday, and we are asked to consider what steps and roles we play when building empathy and justice for others. For a closing exercise, we're going to think, write, or share a reflection about 3 groups of people who may be facing difficult circumstances: a chronic illness, racism, a language barrier, a disability, any discrimination, and how we can grow compassionate support for them, and what actions we can take as bystanders like Mrs. O'Brien. The 3 groups you'll be thinking about are people with whom you have a personal relationship, meaning those you talk to regularly, visit with, or work with. People you know of, meaning friends of friends, distant office workers or classmates, or those with whom you have little to mild interactions. And the 3rd group is the general groups of people who may be facing challenges at large. These can be migrant workers like Mr. Ramirez, or any other social group who faces adversity or difficulty in certain dynamics of society. For each of these groups, ask and answer, what do I know about their situation? What don't I know? Have I asked to learn more? How else can I learn more? How have I helped? What haven't I done? What are some solutions, and how can I contribute? We don't know if Mrs. O'Brien or even Mr. Ramirez himself had the opportunity to prevent or change the situation. As readers of this story, it is our job to remember our calling to value the lives and challenges of our neighbors, whether we know them personally, know of them, or are simply aware of their existence. Bradbury asks our humanity to rise with hope and to act with compassion, never taking for granted the time and chances to appreciate each other. Thank you for joining us for Hearthstory Aware and our reading of Ray Bradbury's I See You Never. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to keep up on future readings and check out our Teachers Pay Teachers store for additional resources. Until next time, stay well and stay aware.